In the modern world, when we think about German colonization efforts, the focus tends to be on Africa. Bismarck holding the Berlin Conference, Kaiser Wilhelm II's popular misquote, Bulow's actual quote that gets attributed to Wilhelm II, and so on. This makes Germany's inclusion in the original Age of Empires 3 launch rather bizarre, as Germany only unified in 1871, so there certainly were no German colonies before that. Oh wait, what's that? The Civ is called Germans, not Germany. And there were German colonization efforts as early as the 1500s. That's right, there were German colonies as early as 1528. So what's the story? Why the heck were the Germans included in the initial launch of AOE3, along with the titans of European imperialism like the British and French? Let's get into some history. So it all starts with this guy, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. Notice the majestic, if not yet defining, chin. This guy was a Habsburg, and not just a Habsburg. He is the Habsburg. The Habsburgs that made the Habsburgs the family name they are today. Well, maybe not in your household, but certainly in mine, much to the annoyance of my wife. Charles ruled over the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, the Netherlands, and claimed most of the Americas. Claims that were becoming actual holdings with the conquests of Cortés and Pizarro. But here's the thing, while Charles was the king of Spain, he wasn't Spanish. His grandparents on his mother's side were Ferdinand and Isabella, of kick the Moors out of Spain, send Columbus to the Americas fame. His dad's father was Emperor Maximilian of the Holy Roman Empire. And despite the Voltaire quote that neckbeards like to throw around on r/history memes, in the 1500s, the HRE was Holy Roman and an empire. The HRE was the 800-pound gorilla on the continent, when the emperor could herd the cats that were the prince-electors. As the heir apparent to the HRE, Charles was born in modern-day Ghent, Belgium, and likely spoke Flemish or Low German dialect as his first language. When he inherited the crowns of Aragon and Castile, he inherited their claims to the New World per the Treaty of Tordesillas. Oh wait, that's not right. No. Tordesillas, as well as some other minor titles. When he was elected Emperor of the HRE, this formed a personal union. As it turns out, buying the Prince-Elector's votes so that you inherit your grandfather's throne is expensive. Very expensive. Of the two other candidates, one was Francis I of France. Gotta love the alliteration there. Francis was Charles's rival and, strangely, his brother-in-law later on. The other candidate was Henry VIII of England, who was a dark horse candidate, who had mostly just put himself forward as an option because he could. Francis was a real threat to Charles, as a union of France and the HRE would likely have resulted in the loss of his Austrian holdings. Charles needed to win. Fortunately, Charles had some German banker friends from the city of Augsburg, a free imperial city in Bavaria, who loaned him vast quantities of money to fund this effort. The exact sum is unknown since these were, bribes, but it's estimated today to be between 140,000 and 300,000 florins, which means at minimum this is equivalent to $20 million today. These mad lads were the Welser family, led by Bartholomeus Welser V. Now, Bartholomeus had a magnificent idea. You see, he was a rich banker, but he wanted to be more rich. And he had seen the gold and the silver coming back with the conquistadors and heard tales coming back from the Americas, of provinces in the jungle rich in gold and protected only by hapless, smallpox-susceptible Indians, of a tribe so rich in gold that their king was coated in it. Maybe even a city made of gold. That's right, ya boy Bartholomeus wanted to find Now, it's worth noting at this point, El Dorado was not the fully fledged myth we know of today, but instead was rumors of a land so rich in gold that Indians would literally cover their king in gold, which came from a real tradition of the Muisca people, who would coat their new chief in mud with a thin coating of gold dust before jumping into Lake Guadavita during his inauguration ceremony. Following Charles's election in 1519, he was not in a position to pay his own soldiers to prevent them from sacking Rome, let alone pay off a massive bribery debt. Charles had put up a good chunk of the New World as collateral for the loan, and in 1528, Bartholomeus cashed that in. Charles issued a charter giving the Welsers the rights to explore, rule, and colonize a new colony in modern-day Venezuela. And one of Welsers' primary reasons is he wanted to find that sweet, sweet gold. Now, Charles implemented some rather pesky restrictions. While this was to be a German chartered colony, due to the complications of monarchies, the land was always under the Spanish crown, not the HRE. So the colony leadership would be German, and German colonists were allowed, but almost all of the soldiers had to be Spanish or Flemish. Remember, Belgium at this time was the Habsburg Netherlands and was Charles's personal fief in the HRE. I'm sure this division of powers won't cause any power struggles. This colony was called Klein Venedig, named after Venice, since the natives lived there in raised huts. I guess like in Venice? Now, considering the only lasting legacies of El Dorado are an underrated DreamWorks movie and a pitiful sequel to National Treasure, you would guess they never found it. And you would be correct. The attempt at colonization lasted 18 years, with at least 4 separate governors. Bartholomeus Welser V would never go, of course, because that would require labor, and wealthy bankers who claim descent from the legendary general Belisarius don't do that. Well, the Germans never found El Dorado. They were initially productive, with an initial batch of 300 settlers, founding the city of Neu-Nuremberg, named after one of the imperial seats, today known as Maracaibo, and taking over a small settlement called Santa Ana de Coro, renaming it to Neu-Augsburg after the Welsers' hometown, establishing it as their capital, and exploring the South American interior. Now, these governors were pretty interested in finding that mythical gold, and were a tad reckless. The first governor of Klein Venedig, Ambrosius Ehinger, was the most ambitious and hardworking of the bunch. A loyal agent of the Welsers, who led their business interests on the island of Hispaniola, he was the obvious choice. He led 2 years-long expeditions, finding a good deal of wealth on the first, and a good deal of death on the second. While returning to Neu-Augsburg in 1533 on his disastrous second expedition, his bedraggled men got into a tussle with some local natives, and he took a poisoned arrow to the neck, and died 4 days later. However, the expedition was successful from one point of view. The explorers brought back 100 kilograms of gold, and lost about as much on the journey back due to an astonishing level of incompetence. The German conquistadors' appetites had been whetted. The second governor, Nikolaus Fetterman, was removed as governor in 1534 before he even reached the colony, as it was revealed that he had gone completely off the rails during Ehinger's first expedition. So in response, Fetterman did the most logical thing, which was to ditch the new governor, launch his own unauthorized expedition to find El Dorado and reach the Pacific, running into some Spanish conquistadors and jointly founding Bogota, the capital of Colombia, along the way. Now, the observant among you will notice that Colombia is not in Venezuela. The Welsers also noticed this, and essentially imprisoned him for breach of contract when he returned to Europe, where he died in prison. Somehow, Fetterman decided returning to Europe to brag to Charles on how he had disobeyed orders with nothing significant to show for it was a good idea. The third governor, Georg von Speyer, delved deep into the jungle, found nothing, was abandoned by Fetterman as he yelled YOLO while diving into the jungle, and barely made it back to the colony, and died from the after effects in 1540. Now, you'll probably notice at this point, I've ignored what was going on in the colony itself. And that's because the Welsers and the governors did too. As the colony was established, the main focus was supposed to be on mining gold. Since the expeditions resulted in a noticeable lack of gold mines, the German miners didn't have much to do. The tropical climate wasn't exactly welcoming for the settlers coming from Northern Europe, so agriculture didn't take off, resulting in large imports of food. Records from the colony actually indicate that only 1/3 of the food needed was actually grown there. Local exports like exotic hardwoods were not profitable. The only profitable thing in the colony ended up being enslaving the local natives! Despite clear instructions from Charles to not oppress and enslave the natives, the settlers got around this edict, relying on the cunning strategy of ignoring him. Instead of prospecting, farming, or trading, most of the settlers decided the prospect of raiding the countryside with the conquistadors to seize gold and slaves was much more appealing. So instead of turning Klein Venedig into a prosperous colony, it was essentially just home base for a series of incompetent conquistadors. After von Speyer died, things started going downhill. I guess even more downhill. In a foreboding move, Spanish authorities in Santo Domingo appointed a Spanish bishop, Rodrigo de Bastidas, the fourth governor, over the Welsers agent who was expected to be given the governorship, Philip von Hutten. He was instead appointed as the captain general, essentially the lieutenant governor of the colony, likely due to his age, as he was only 30. Despite this, von Hutten was functionally the real governor, and, like his predecessors, was determined to find El Dorado. His expedition got off to a better start than the previous ones, as Bartholomeus' son, creatively also named Bartholomeus, joined von Hutten and went out with him in 1541, where they then proceeded to get effectively lost for 5 whole years, re-emerging from the jungle in 1546. Instead of emerging to a hero's welcome, or at least a bowl of hot soup, they found instead a Spaniard, named Juan de Carvajal, as the new captain general and acting governor, having been appointed under the assumption that von Hutten was dead, which is a reasonable assumption when someone is missing for 5 years. Carvajal had a rather acrimonious relationship with the Welser family, due to an alleged mistreatment when he was a soldier in an early expedition under Ehinger, and rather predictably was not happy to see the actual governor return, and sought to arrest him. This failed when the jungle-hardened Welser VI beat Carvajal in a fight and forced Carvajal to grant them safe passage. Von Hutten, living in the 16th century, had not seen the Princess Bride, and therefore did not know he should not trust the word of a Spaniard. Carvajal then, shockingly, betrayed them, and used good old-fashioned murder to keep his position. While Carvajal was executed in 1546 for this betrayal, with the death of von Hutten and Welser VI, the German attempt to colonize Venezuela was functionally over, as Charles V rightfully viewed the whole thing as a complete disaster, revoking the Welsers' rights to the territory in 1546, only appointing Spanish governors thereafter, with the charter completely reverting to the Spanish crown after a nice round of lawsuits and the abdication of Charles V in 1556. So what was the result of this first German attempt at colonization? Well, over the 18 years, around 500 German settlers, over 700 soldiers, and 4,000 slaves were sent to the colony, and most of them died on expeditions and native attacks or from illnesses. Unknown masses of natives were killed in battles. Thousands of natives were taken into slavery and exported to Spanish colonies. 2 cities were founded, the modern-day cities of Maracaibo and Bogota, but were taken over by the Spanish. So the Welsers didn't benefit. One of the Welsers was dead. They lost a lot of money. And no El Dorado. So that's the dumpster fire that was Klein Venedig. But that wasn't the only early German attempt at colonization. There was one more of note, that of Brandenburg-Prussia. Now this story takes place in the 1680s to 1720s. Back in 1680, the state of Prussia did not exist. Instead, Friedrich Wilhelm was the Elector of Brandenburg, and, get this, electorate in the HRE, and Duke of Prussia, a vassal of Poland. And of his territories, Brandenburg was the most valuable one by far. Friedrich Wilhelm was a pretty good ruler. So good, in fact, he may have even been great. Maybe even the Great Elector. He came to power at the tail end of the 30 Years' War, which devastated most of mainland Europe and the lands of the HRE the most. Despite inheriting what may be charitably described as a pile of rubble, Berlin at the end of the war had a whopping population of 6,000. Friedrich Wilhelm restored his domain so well that his son was able to make himself a king. He had a knack for foresight and big picture thinking. And what's more big picture than the Atlantic Triangle? In 1680, Friedrich Wilhelm enlisted the help of a Dutch pirate-turned-Brandenburger admiral, Benjamin Rauhl, to buy goods on the Gold Coast. This mission was more successful than anticipated, and despite the Dutch seizing one of two ships for trading in what they considered their territory, the local Ahanta people, part of the Akan, did not recognize Dutch trading rights in the area, and signed a treaty allowing the Brandenburgers to build a fort in the area. Overjoyed, in 1682, Friedrich Wilhelm granted a charter to the Brandenburg Africa Company in an attempt to get into the slave trade and replicate the success of the Dutch's East India Company. The charter allowed the company to set up a colony, the Brandenburger Gold Coast, with a capital at the fort of Grossfriedrichsburg. We say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. And that may be true. But the Dutch certainly didn't appreciate it. As far as they were concerned, the Brandenburgers were stepping in on their territory, their trade, their property. And they were in a position to do something about it. In 1682, Brandenburg-Prussia had a fleet of around 34 boats. The Netherlands had over 16,000, out of a total of 25,000 in the entirety of Europe. But obviously, the Gold Coast is pretty far away from the Netherlands, being in Africa and all, and the Brandenburgers weren't actually interfering with the Dutch slave trade, so their opposition mostly took the form of harassment. They seized a secondary fort the Brandenburgers built in 1687 and kept it for years. They enlisted locals to attack the main fort. They left burning bags of dog poo on their porch, etc. All the classic behaviors of bad neighbors. Despite the actions of the Dutch, the colony was pretty valuable for Friedrich Wilhelm. The profits were significant enough that he was able to buy out the other investors within 4 years. And there's only one thing to do with that type of success: expand. In 1685, 2 additional colonies were established. Off the coast of Mauritania, one Captain Rears fought off local Dutch and French forces and occupied an old Portuguese fortress on the island of Arguin, and negotiated a treaty with the local king. This gave Brandenburg-Prussia a trade hub that specialized not in slaves, but in rubber. At the same time, recognizing that you make more money selling slaves if you control a market to sell them at near the customers, Mr. Former Pirate, Benjamin Rauhl, negotiated a deal that leased part of the Caribbean island of St. Thomas from the Danes, today part of the U.S. Virgin Islands territory. And once again, in a totally not ominous note for our Germanic protagonists, the Danish king maintained sovereignty. When the Great Elector died in 1688, his son, Frederick, maintained the course, and Brandenburger efforts to expand continued. Around 1689, an expedition was sent to a nearby small island called Crab Island and claimed it from Brandenburg. Crab Island, also known as Viquez Island, is just off the coast of Puerto Rico, today part of U.S. territory, and was nominally claimed by the Spanish. but realistically was up for grabs. Unfortunately for the Brandenburgers, when they went back in 1692 to solidify their claim, they found it under the control of the Danes, and an attempt to claim a small rock called Peter Island was also unsuccessful, mostly because the island was completely useless. And at this point, things started going south for our German protagonists. Despite the massive profits being reaped at some of the largest slave auctions in history, the Danes and Germans weren't exactly friendly on the island of St. Thomas. And in 1693, the Danes rescinded the lease on St. Thomas after letting French pirates loot the Brandenburgers' colony. Upon losing this lucrative marketplace, the Brandenburg-Prussia efforts started to collapse, as Frederick was unable to find willing partners to maintain the colonies, even after he was declared king in Prussia in 1701. Grossfriedrichsburg fell into disrepair and was largely controlled by a local chieftain named Jan Coney by 1710, and the Brandenburg Africa Company was bankrupt in 1711. When Frederick died and was succeeded by his son, Frederick Wilhelm I, in 1713, colonial efforts ceased, as Frederick Wilhelm was more interested in spending resources on the nascent Prussian army than on maintaining colonial holdings. By 1716, Grossfriedrichsburg had been completely abandoned to their allied natives, and Frederick Wilhelm sold the rights to the colony to the Dutch for the vast sum of 7,200 ducats and 12 slaves, or approximately $1 million today. Okay, that's a pretty bad deal. It's estimated that over the 35 years that the colony was active, that around 30,000 slaves had been sold through the colony at a price of $60 each, for a total of around $45 million. Hilariously, the Dutch were only able to expel the occupying natives in 1724, 7 years after the sale, and then promptly abandoned it. So maybe it really wasn't worth that much at the end. In 1721, the colonial efforts ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. The French had moved in to attack the castle at Arguin, sick of their offshore neighbors playing Oompa Band music all night. And instead of resisting, the garrison simply ran away. And thus ends the tale of German colonization before there was a Germany. So what's the takeaway? Was it all sound and fury signifying nothing? Well, frankly, for the most part, yeah. However, there were some lasting effects. The colony of Klein Venedig ultimately established Venezuela as a Spanish colony, and resulted in the foundation of Maracaibo, what is today the second largest city in Venezuela, and made the city of Coro into a real city. Largely ignored and forgotten outside of Venezuela, these German conquistadors left a significant mark there, and it is remembered and taught in Venezuela as an important part of their history. Likewise, Fetterman's erratic expedition resulted in the foundation of Bogota, the capital of Colombia. In a similar vein, the Brandenburg Africa Company left very little of permanence, aside from one decrepit fort on the UNESCO World Heritage Site list. The depopulation of Africa due to chattel slavery was unaffected by this one small slaver outpost, and there were no lasting impacts in Africa from this short-lived colony. However, it was certainly profitable, and a crucial lifeline for Brandenburg-Prussia as it emerged from the wreckage of the 30 Years' War. The exact impact is difficult to quantify, but it certainly contributed to the rise of Prussia in the 18th century. Unfortunately, most scholarship on these early German colonies focuses on their influences on rising nationalism in the 19th century and their propaganda value during the 20th. Most papers in circulation concerning Klein Venedig were published between 1938 and 1945 and read more as anti-Germany propaganda pieces than as serious research, elevating the cruelties of the Welser family and their agents to ludicrous heights, and focusing more on the Nazis than on the colony. In a similar vein, the Imperial Germans and later the Nazi Party used Klein Venedig and the Gold Coast as evidence of their equal stature with the other great empires, although not heavily, as both projects were failures and really don't support that interpretation. Due to this taint, these fascinating early attempts at colonization are largely ignored and maligned. And that's what makes part of the Germans' inclusion in Age of Empires 3 so special. The team at Ensemble back in 2005 included the Germans, not the Austrians or Prussians, because of these two small attempts at colonization that touched the New World. The in-game compendium says as much. Certainly, Austria and Prussia factored into that original design, given their impacts in the 19th century, but the fundamental fact is that Age of Empires 3 at launch was focused on colonization of the New World, an effort that neither the Kingdom of Prussia or the Austrian Empire had anything to do with. Both Klein Venedig and the Brandenburger outpost on St. Thomas were gone before there was even a king in Prussia or an independent Eastern realm. Instead, it was efforts by ethnic Germans under the nominal rule of the Holy Roman Empire that attempted to colonize the Americas. And Age of Empires 3 pays homage to that sometimes funny, sometimes dark, strangely beautiful, quirky, largely forgotten piece of history. Thanks for listening. Now go and play some Age of Empires.